one of my greatest mentors. Actually, I did learn a lot from him since I did like a course of business agility with him. A man that has lots of things to say and a huge experience. I'm very happy, Peter, for you being here with us. Thank you very much for your presence. I think you are muted, Peter.
Sorry, I was saying it's an honor to follow Evan. So with that kind of build-up, I feel a little bit sheepish.
It's going to be good. I always love what you have to say. So,
okay. Well, can I begin by picking a fight with you?
Oh, okay. All right. I'll hang on for a bit.
I agree with almost everything you said, but it is possible, if you frame it as a pull transformation, to generate not cultural change, but the kernel of a new culture, and get real results out of that much quicker than you might have been.
So I'm going to violently agree with you, right? Yeah. Because all transformations should be pull, right? And imposed transformation is not something that is sustainable, right? And the key word I had was sustainable. You create a pull transformation, you will create a kernel, and the organization antibodies will fight against it. And it's going to take about 8 years before that disappears. And again, that's an average, right? A smaller organization, it might be 2 or 3. A mega corporation will never reach that point.
Well, again, I'll slightly disagree, but I think what I'm about to talk about kind of gives a larger context for the answer. So I appreciate your violent agreement, and I expect by the end of this, I will be violently agreeing with you too. Ecosystems thinking in a very colorful looking picture. This is one of 2 talks I'm giving over the next couple of weeks, and the other one is very tactically focused. How do we deal with what's happened with the enormous upheaval to all businesses everywhere? Evan was just ticking the boxes on. We need something very direct and pragmatic. And so if you're interested in that talk, I kind of put a preview of it up on LinkedIn yesterday. It's called X Beast. But this talk is about a shift in perspective. And in many ways, a shift in perspective as profound as the original shift to an agile perspective. I want to kind of creep up on this idea. So this is a more abstract talk than the other one, because the other one is intended to give an immediate answer. This is more the frame around the answer. And when it comes to ecosystems, I'm not just talking about biological. I'm not talking about the beautiful plants and the beautiful animals, although I really care about the beautiful plants and the beautiful animals. But I'm thinking about human ecosystems, business ecosystems, learning ecosystems. And when we talk about a transformation, I see that as a snapshot of the evolution of a learning ecosystem. So we need to understand more about what this weird word means, because we all think it's, rubbing crystals and standing out naked in the rain and all kinds of lovely things you really like to do, but you're too busy with the things that are happening to you. We're going to look at ecosystem as a network of mutual benefit. And I'll try and put that in current context first. We think this little critter, this nasty little critter, is the problem. And I'm going to suggest to you this is not the problem. There's, I just want to move that over because I can't read my own writing then. This experience we're having, that this comes from a design flaw in our human ecosystem. And the design flaw itself has to do with a flaw in the way we think about design. So design thinking is not something I'm going to rubbish, but I am going to suggest that it's incomplete and fluffy, and we can do better. And there is a lovely school of thought called permaculture we're going to draw on and generalize in trying to do better. So I didn't pick this picture at random. I don't know if you've ever seen this device these kids are on before. You might not see it anytime soon because it doesn't bloody work. It's a thing called a play pump. A bunch of the design thinking people thought, oh, we really need to apply design thinking to third world problems. And one of the big third world problems is fresh water. And it takes an awful lot of effort to tap sources of fresh water and then pump them into systems and so that you can actually make use of them. So what if we hooked up a pumping mechanism to a bit of kids' play equipment? This was supposed to be about how we will apply modern design thinking per IDEO and D School to the plight of Africa. I think we better have something in this presentation that has something to do with Africa. It'd be a bit sad if we didn't. Well, if you're familiar with this device, the nature of the failure is very simple. African kids don't play with play equipment like this. It's not something they've ever seen before. They're not particularly interested in it. And if they don't play with it, it doesn't pump any water. There's something very weird here. If we think of the problem is we want to pump water, and we have empathy, we go and we understand the problem, and we understand from the point of view of the people, and we do all of the 6 bubbles or the 5 hexagons or whatever, the 2 diamonds, whatever formulation of design thinking you happen to favor. What went wrong here? I'm going to suggest to you that what went wrong was that they were trying to solve a problem. They weren't trying to think in terms of the human ecosystem within which that problem exists. So this is not just about a flaw that affects Africa. Some years ago, New York was hit by a hurricane called Sandy, and it cost New York $19 billion to clean up. Well, the design thinking guys went, ha, 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 ha. There is a prize. There is a prize. It's a $10 million prize for coming out with a great design for how to fix this. And we are going to use design thinking. We're going to go to the places that were flooded. We're going to empathize with the people who were flooded. We're going to understand their experience from their point of view. We're going to talk with them, and we will wind up, after we have done some ideating and prototyping and testing, we will wind up with a beautiful solution. And they did. And it's a solution everybody has loved. And it's cheap. And it cost $3 billion to build this thing. Well, they're building it at the moment. It's called the Dry Line, the Manhattan Dry Line. And it's basically a system of barriers and berms that will keep the water out, which is fantastic. And it will remain fantastic until about 2050. With current levels of sea level rise, around about 2050 is when the first hurricane will wash tides over the top of this berm. And then all of that water that washes over the top of this berm will sit in Manhattan for years, and it will never be able to drain out again. What? Design thinking seems to have neglected something really important about New York as an ecosystem, because right now the water drained out again, and if you put this solution in place, it won't. So yes, it's only $3 billion, but if it's $3 billion and it makes Manhattan uninhabitable after 2050, it might not be money well spent, even if everyone who's currently looking forward to having their property prices go through the roof because of this beautiful urban renewal project, they love it. But it doesn't deal with the ecosystem problem. I want to make this a little bit closer to most of our Angelists' hearts. I don't know how many people had one of these. I didn't have one, but I would be proud to have one now. It's an amazing device, incredible engineering, and the worst designed phone in history.
I always wanted one.
Yeah, it's
it looked amazing.
Yeah, the only thing it didn't have technically that iPhone had was it didn't have a touch screen, but MP3 player and an email client and web browser, and it also worked as a phone. I mean, it did everything that iPhone did. And 4 years before iPhone, and it sank without a trace. Nokia were kind of unhappy with that, so they brought IDEO in, and they said, well, we would like you to fix the design of this phone. And they did, as you can see, much, much better look and feel. And well, I'm not saying there's anything particularly wrong with chocolate-colored plastic, and they fixed the problem where you had to pry off the battery compartment to put in the Atari-style cartridge to load up the software to run the phone, but by moving the slot for the cartridge to the side. Suffice to say that didn't work too well either. So the phone was called N-Gage, and Nokia retired that line of phones, but they still had the brand. And so when iPhone turned up and really started impacting their business, they asked IDEO, okay, this time we think you can help us properly, because the problem we've got is the App Store. We don't have an App Store for this thing. We had that little slot on the side, and we are getting killed. And we're going to use this brand for the Symbian App Store, call it N-Gage. We want you to design the experience. And IDEO did. And they made a beautiful App Store. And 1 year later, it was discontinued. Because they didn't design an ecosystem. They designed an experience. So this idea of ecosystem design is critically important. And whether we apply design thinking tenets to it or something else, the objective, the frame for the work is different. We have to understand a bit more about design and ecosystems to be able to approach this. So Jobs was explicitly skeptical of design thinking. He quoted Henry Ford, who had said that if he'd asked what people wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And Jobs said that there's no way you can know what they want or they can know what they want until you show it to them. And now he was in a business where he used his own stuff. And so it was easy for him to say that. What did he actually do? What did Apple actually do? How did they design this incredibly successful ecosystem? How did they become the most successful company in the world almost overnight? There had to be some intelligence to that. It didn't just happen. Nokia had been banging away at this problem for a long time. Well, if you go looking up how did Jobs do design, you'll wind up with this beautiful Picasso picture. This is one of the few things that Apple have published about their design philosophy. And it dates back to when Jobs was deathly ill, and they had this thing called Apple University that was trying to transmit his wisdom to the rest of the company. And if you look at it, well, I don't know if you're very excited about Picasso. I wasn't until I understood this picture. The top left bull is probably the most photorealistic thing that Picasso ever drew in his life. And I dare say if you sat down and really worked at it for an afternoon, you'd get something like that. That's not too hard to do. The middle left bull, that thing looks weird. If you saw that in the field, you'd be calling the UFO squad. He's exaggerated every design feature. And then the one below that, he's kind of the same thing, but he's drawn little white lines between every design element. And then in the middle column, he's reducing it. He's removing design elements or simplifying them. And he keeps doing that until you get this thing here, just above the signature, the ultimate minimal expression of a bull. Now, when you understand this is design in the sense of literally de-signing, of taking away everything that is not necessary, well, then you start to get an idea about how Apple did their stuff. But there is something more fundamental to this picture that probably hasn't leapt out at you yet. I mean, obviously, if I take anything away from that bull, even that heavy line underneath it, on the minimal representation, no longer looks like a bull, looks like, I don't know, bed sheets on a clothesline. But look at the signature underneath. That's got that heavy line. The tail of the P looks like the tail of the bull. The O looks like the head of the bull. The S's look like the legs. This is Picasso telling us something about Picasso, about art, about who he was, what he did. And it's not just about design. It's about the art ecosystem where this picture only has value because of the signature. And if we had longer, I'd love to tell you about Elmir Dahuri, who forged, amongst other things, many, many Picassos, but never the signature. He let the art dealers forge the signatures. So the art ecosystem has a structure, and its structure is similar to almost all business ecosystems. And we need to understand something about the structure of business ecosystems and learning ecosystems if we're going to make some progress with this idea. So, oh, we're doing okay. Let me go that way. All right. We are used to thinking about these devices in isolation. We're not used to thinking about the idea that they occupy a space. And we're not used to thinking about it because it's a complicated space. There are a great many variables in this space. And we're so used to thinking, well, this phone's a little bit different to that phone. And it's got this that the other one doesn't have. We're not used to thinking about the market impact as a critical aspect of the phone. But consider the phone as a device. If you took it back to 1969 and you handed it to one of the Apollo engineers and you said, what does this do? They wouldn't be able to figure it out because there were no frequency hopping radios, except in secret military installations back in 1969. So it would have appeared to be an inert lump of plastic with some colored lights on the front as far as they were concerned. After it ran out of battery because there was nothing to charge it with, that's all it would have been. So it's really the service ecosystem, the way that people are connected through these things as channels. That's what iPhone is. That's what all these phones are. We look at them as devices and we think about, you hear Johnny Ive talk about the bezels and the bevels and all the sexy curves, and he starts using this very exciting accent. And I've got an exciting accent of my own. But with my accent, I'm not particularly interested in that stuff. I really want to understand, how do you stand up and say, you know what, I think we're going to disrupt the telephonic ecosystem across the entire planet, and actually set out to do that. Because that's not about an experience. That's not about a device. That's something else. And if we're going to have business agility, we're going to have to understand that, because that's business. So part of the problem is the dimensionality. The volume, the hypervolume of a space increases exponentially, sometimes super exponentially, with the number of dimensions. So that means spaces with lots of dimensions. Well, you might think, we understand everything. This is where we're selling a lot of phones, this kind of device, and this kind of device, we don't sell any of them. So we better make certain that we just observe these distinctions. But the moment you add another dimension, boing, these things get smeared across that dimension. If you add another 3 or 4, then they spread out in the hypervolume until you can't see any significant clusters of data at all. So then you start going, well, I need a lot more data, which is sort of the very complicated Rubik's Cube on the right. And the obvious problem with the Rubik's Cube on the right is the combinatorial complexity. When you add an awful lot more data, then doing the analysis takes a bloody long time. And that means that a lot of the reasoning systems we're used to dealing with don't work very well when it comes to ecosystem design, because it's necessarily highly dimensional. So to cover it real quick, I'll skip over the first two. Deductive reasoning, you know that. You've got a rule, all swans are white, I have a swan, therefore my swan is white. Honk, don't find the black swan that way. inductive reasoning from the specifics to the rule. Grandpa swan's white, mama swan's white, therefore all swans are white. Still doesn't help me find my black swan. All right. Design thinking is based on abductive reasoning. A 19th century bloke named Peirce came up with this. And it's basically the kids' game of hot and cold. Is it a white swan? Well, no, we prototyped it. It's not a white swan, but you're warm, very warm. Okay. Well, is it a duck? No, you're getting colder. Market says no. Oh, all right. Well, then how about a chicken? There's nothing in abductive reasoning that guarantees that if you are iterating on an N-Gage or an N95, your Nokia, that you're going to find some way to get to an iPhone. You just won't see it, even though you're pouring billions into this market. So how can we find the black swan? There's a system of reasoning that you're familiar with from Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle's great detective, who claimed to be making deductions. But if you look at what he was doing, he wasn't making deductions. He talks about his method. When we eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be, well, in our case, must be the product. So, can it swim? Well, yes, they can all swim. Is it the size of a duck or smaller? No, it's not. Okay, we can eliminate a whole huge swathe of the universe. This is also a children's game. This is the game of 20 questions. Is it white? No, it's not white. We just eliminated another big swathe of the universe. With the game of hot and cold, two kids can play in a single room and find anything in that room. But if one of them thinks of something, anything in the universe, they can't find it with a game of hot and cold. With the game of 20 questions, they can. Because every one of these distinctions pairs away a big, highly dimensional chunk of the universe. We're making distinctions. And that's very powerful. We do it breadth first. So we have one other problem. Design space does not sit still. We need to understand it in terms that are dynamic. We need to understand the bottleneck in a business ecosystem or a learning ecosystem. Because if we don't understand that, then we won't know what to focus our efforts on. We won't know where the impact is. Now, I did say at the start of this that this is the much less concrete, more philosophical, more mindset-oriented talk. But I do want to ground this in iPhone as an ecosystem. So I'll give you this idea about pirate metrics, which some of you are already only too well aware of and familiar with. I'll give it to you quick, and then I'll try and apply it. So pretty obviously I've got to use pirate ships, otherwise it's no fun. And I dug out this old slide. I did a little bit of photoshopping and, well, okay. So acquisition. We have to give the customer some benefit or they're just not going to turn up. And we can market the hell out of it. But if you think about Google in its early days, it wasn't marketing that made Google the most popular search service on the planet, even before they knew how to monetize it. It was that it gave you some value. You got a little bit of a search out of it, and that was useful. And you didn't have to look at a bunch of advertising, and that not having to look at a bit of advertising, that was the value it gave you. It wasn't necessarily a much better search than the others, at least back in the day. So acquisition, we are going to acquire not just customers. We have to acquire suppliers. We have to acquire distributors. We have to acquire partners. We have all kinds of participants in the ecosystem in a network of mutual benefit that we have to acquire. And they all have to get some benefit out of what we're doing, otherwise they won't turn up. That's acquisition. Activation. Well, they have to identify themselves. It's not enough. Sorry, Ahmed, are you going to say something or shall I continue? I think he's just unmuted accidentally. Anyway, okay, so it's not enough that they turn up. We have to know who they are, at least well enough to bill someone for their behavior. If Google couldn't put a cookie in your browser, then they couldn't bill the advertisers for your behavior. So that's activation. Doesn't mean that they know who you are, doesn't mean they have the credit card details. It just means that they can, in principle, be billed for your behavior. Okay, well, what's going to make you keep on having a cookie in your browser? Gmail, Google Calendar, all of the authentication systems that you're able to get at using Google, all of that makes you keep the cookie in your browser. You don't want to get rid of that cookie. That would be very inconvenient. They also have to prove to the advertisers you're human, that they're not retaining just some random number. This cookie means a human, and that's why they own all of the capture services. So it's a Turing test. It's how they prove that you are a human to their advertisers. Nothing to do with giving you a benefit. So retention is all about retaining the participants in the ecosystem, in their case, both the advertisers and you. All right, then referral, the viral cycle. We want one kind of participant to bring more in. That's kind of obvious. And then return. Well, return isn't necessarily a chest full of loot. Return could be reduction in risk. Return could be learning. Lots of forms of return. The original, this comes from Dave McClure, who had an incubator in San Francisco called 500 Startups. He invented the pirate metrics. He just had revenue on the end. But for public sector organizations, for example, risk reduction is really their idea about return. They don't give a damn about revenue. So, okay, that's all pretty. We've got these water spouts. The idea is those are the entrances to other people's ecosystems. And once someone is sucked up by one of those, you're not going to get them back in a hurry. So why pirate metrics? Well, apart from the fact, the reason they're called pirate metrics is because the acronym is R. But why pirate metrics? Why are those constant across all these ecosystems? We think of a learning ecosystem. We're doing a transformation. We're coaches, and we want to acquire participants into our learning ecosystem. Evan just blessed this idea of pull transformation, which XSCALE's been championing for quite some time now. The idea of pull transformation is that we start by locating just the progressives, just the change champions from the business, from design, from delivery, from DevOps, and we bring them together and integrate them into a very slender but end-to-end value stream. And we can then mature it. And because they're champions, they can mature really quickly. And then we can split it into, and we can backfill with the next most progressive, and we can basically grow this uncompromised, end-to-end, full-blown business agile capability. We can grow it at an exponential rate by splitting and doubling. That's not what this talks about. Sorry, I did say this is the abstract one. Anyway, we have to be able to acquire people. We have to be able, well, activation is just coaching and training and the stuff that we're used to doing. Retention, what's retention when it comes to learning ecosystems? We've all had the experience of coaches of coming back 6 months after we had done a good job coaching a team into a beautiful high-performing state, and we come back and they're using Gantt charts. And we go, what the heck is wrong with you guys? What happened? Well, see, we've got this manager, and the manager really, really wants a baseline. And we didn't have any agile things to give us a baseline. And they wanted us to do a big design up front. And we didn't have any agile things that gave us a big design up front. And they wanted to know what the budget was. We didn't have any agile things that did that either. And this Gantt chart thing, it seems to do that. So we're using that. We don't have any metrics that we have installed that tell us how well the organization is doing on its agile journey. Not much of a journey if it goes backwards. So if we don't have metrics in place, we don't have feedback loops, we aren't going to retain the capability. What you don't measure, you can't optimize. Okay, referral. Well, I just talked about the splitting and doubling. For pull transformation, that's easy. What does referral mean if it's a push transformation? It probably means certificates. It probably means we want to promote some Scrum Masters to be coaches. No, I don't think so. And then return. Well, it could be the business throughput improvement we get out of doing this if we do it properly. But it could also be the flow of learning through the organization. And that's a really interesting concept because that's not a loop that we see in Scrum. We'll come back to that another time because that's not what this talks about either. Okay, so turn that back upside down again. iPhone as an ecosystem. Where am I in time? I'm not doing too bad. Okay, I am trying to cover some ground, and I should say though, please do, if a question occurs to you, please do just stick it in the chat so that you don't have to hold on to it in your head, and we can get to it at the end if I'm not silly enough to use up all the time, which I have a bad habit of doing. iPhone as ecosystem. How do you design iPhone as an ecosystem? Well, the first thing we think of is this magical experience to reach out and touch the internet. No, forget that. That's nothing to do with iPhone as ecosystem. Biggest problem Apple had was this: the most expensive phone in the world. Steve Ballmer gave an interview where he was laughing at them, saying the most expensive phone in the world doesn't even have a keyboard. Ha 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 ha. He didn't know what he was talking about, pretty obviously, and it cost him his job. What did they do? Well, they had been getting killed in CompUSA and the other big box third-party stores by a script that, to cut a long story short, basically went, well, sir or madam, we know you love this beautifully designed iPod, but we want you to have a choice. Here is a cheap Chinese knockoff. It doesn't have the screen or the click wheel and all of its curves and so on, just little chiclet keys, but it sounds the same and it holds as many songs and it costs half as much. Which would you like to buy today, sir or madam? They were getting killed. So they had to invent the Apple stores. You might go, well, that's marketing. No, these are machines for retailing iPhones, and outrageously successful machines. It meant that they could completely control the acquisition experience, and it meant that when they sold these things, the way that people thought about what they were doing could be completely different, which it couldn't be if you were in a store full of other junk. We'll come back to that. So, and yeah, there's a bunch more we could say about Apple stores. They monitor your face and your posture and your movements. They throw all of the data they get from all these hidden cameras into really fancy data mining models. And this is how they're able to predict just that golden moment where you have, after wandering around the store for half an hour, you have decided that little thing on the shelf there, you might want to buy one of those. And that's the moment when someone in a colorful t-shirt just magically pops up behind you and says, can I help you, sir or madam? There's a lot more to say about that we're not going to say today. Activation. Remember the magic white cable, the incredible little white cable, extraordinary bandwidth. This thing would suck your entire iTunes library down through this little white cable and charge the phone at the same time. And it was the first thing everybody wanted to do so that they could use the phone as an iPod as well. And it was the most seamless activation experience in history. You didn't even realize that with the iTunes library came the iTunes account. With the iTunes account came your credit card details, and suddenly they were in the phone. And now you could buy things. You could buy things on other phones, but when you bought things on other phones, the charges went on the phone bill. That was the contract that Nokia had signed with every telco on the planet. Steve Jobs turned up with a contract that said that if you were going to do business with him, then he was going to bill the customer directly. And you, the telco, you are not going to bill the customer. And very few telcos would play that way. He gave AT&T a sweetheart deal, a special. They would be the only people in America who could distribute iPhones. That was how he was able to get them over the line. And that one contract was like throwing a stone in a pond. Ripples of disruption came from that contract that completely overturned all of the assumptions in the telecommunications industry about how this business worked. This is activation. because it's activation of the telco. Activation doesn't do you any good if you're only activating the customers. You can't design the ecosystem that way. You have to think about all of the participants. It's about mutual benefit. Okay, retention. Well, that's where this screen thing came in. Everybody who tried it went, "Oh, that's nice. Oh, I'd like to do that again. Bob, can I borrow your iPhone and do that again?" But that's not the kind of retention that we're really focusing on when it comes to an ecosystem. When it comes to an ecosystem, this was the glass front on the stores and the row upon row upon row of devices, all loaded up with software, all attached to a live internet, not just little mocked up bits of plastic. You could go in and you could play games all day in the Apple Store if you wanted to. Every time you walk by, your child would drag you in, "Daddy, Daddy, I want to play Flappy Birds or Angry Birds or some kind of birds." It's like a free video game parlor. Everybody wanted to go and play, and you would go in again and again and again. That's retention. Even if you hadn't bought one of these things yet, which you hadn't, you keep entering the ecosystem and having the experience of the ecosystem over and over and over again. That's retention. Now, notice something about these curves I'm drawing. If they're red, it eliminates part of the design space. When we took things out of the big box stores, we no longer need to support the big box stores. We no longer need to market for the big box stores. There's a whole bunch of things we don't need to do. With the green curves, these are things where we have to stay inside this. So with the contract offered to AT&T, that was the only kind of contract that Apple would agree to. They wouldn't agree to any contracts that didn't stipulate that Apple was going to do the billing. So even for things like iMessage, which cut into the SMS business, so most telcos didn't want to do that. This is about designing the ecosystem. It's about the relationship between the different participants. So free SMS, but only to iOS users. Why? Apple could have done anything on this phone. They could have shipped any software. They relied on third parties to build almost all the software. Why did they build iMessage themselves? Well, they had a problem. And the problem is this: most expensive phone in the world. It gets sold to high net worth individuals and people who like to brag about their phones in boardrooms. Nobody else is going to lash out that much money on a phone. So it comes to Christmas time. How do you get Big Bill, the boardroom bully, to buy a phone? Almost with the Bourbon and Beefsteak bistro bar joke, but I'm not going to go there. Anyway, how do you get him to buy the phone for little Susie, who would love to have his phones always playing on his phone? Well, Big Bill, the boardroom bully, doesn't want to buy the phone for little Susie because it will spoil her. It's a very expensive phone, you know. But wait a second, little Susie racks up $500 a year in SMS fees. If I buy her one of these, effectively the phone's free and she'll love it. Oh, okay, I'll get it for her. iMessage jumped over the generational divide. Suddenly little Susie and little Jenny and so on, they've got phones in the playground and the others don't, and they all start nagging, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, I want one of these." It's very hard to put up with that pressure when you know you're going to save $500 a year. So Find My Friends is a similar play. We won't talk about that one now. Okay. Well, then on return, the App Store obsoleted the entire software retailing industry overnight. But it's not about revenue. Nothing to do with revenue. Apple went from a company that was selling songs for pennies to millions of people to a company that was selling $100 devices or multi-$100 devices to the same millions of people. They multiplied the value of their market by a factor of 10,000 overnight. This is ecosystem design. But there's one group of participants we didn't mention. The software developers. If they don't play, then we don't have an ability to get those people onto this device. They have to play. Return is developer mindshare. How do we get that? Well, The developers are used to 70% of the retail value of their product goes to the publisher, who puts the CD-ROM in the empty cardboard box, and goes to the retailer, who puts the empty cardboard box on the shelf. What if we gave the 70% to the software developer and only took 30 cents? Which is really just a token, because if you're making hundreds of dollars per device, let's say they buy $21 apps in the first year, that's still only $6. You don't give a damn about that. But you want those developers, because every developer brings their own ecosystem. It's a platform play. This is ecosystem design. And we can do the same thing when we're talking about learning ecosystem. We have a technique we call Pirate Canvas. You can look that up another time, because I'm not going to talk about it now. How do we draw these curves in reality? Because it's a highly dimensional space. I can't just draw a line on a two-dimensional piece of paper and hope that magic will happen. But I do have this wonderful bit of language in Agile called behavior-driven, something beginning with D. I'm going to say design. So the most general form, given the system is behaving in a certain way at the system interface, when the external universe behaves in a certain way, then the system changes its behavior in a certain way. And there's more syntax to BDD than that, but you get the idea. You can composite these things. I'm not saying that Apple under Jobs used BDD. It hadn't been invented yet. But they used something that was equivalent to it. It's about making distinctions. It brings us back to the Sherlock Holmes method. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm not going to say that now either. We've been talking about ecosystems for a while. And there's a kind of ecosystems thinking that we have drawn some principles from. And I want to talk about those principles a little bit. And the kind of ecosystems thinking I'm talking about is called permaculture. This is a diagram of a permaculture farm. And as you can see, this farm does not look like this. If you are used to flying over middle America and you look out your plane window and you see this, very rich farmland in America, industrial agriculture does not look like this. Permaculture was invented by a couple of mad Australians, Bill Mollison and Dave Holmgren. They had this crazy idea that after the year 2000, the shit would hit the fan and civilization would become impossible to maintain. They thought it was going to happen because of running out of fossil fuels. Year 2000 happened, and I personally was a Y2K nut, but most people weren't, and nothing really drastic happened. And I was perfectly happy with that. I really love civilization, and I wasn't sitting up in the hills with an Uzi. I was sitting in my house in Coronado, guarded by 3 aircraft carriers. I believe in big guns. But the thing about Y2K was that it made us think, how fragile are the systems that we're working with? Are there design flaws in them? And we have seen there is a design flaw in our ecosystem. And we need to apply ecosystems thinking to it. And that means in the short term, in the organizations that we consult to, and in the long term, when it comes to their market ecosystems. And this is where business agility involves a shift in perspective, because we're used to thinking of value streams as starts here, stuff we manufacture, and it goes there. Our customers, like the Agile Manifesto says, our highest value is pleasing those customers. Well, what we've seen, and we see this with every large business these days, whether it's banks or hospitals or Google, Facebook, Apple, Uber, Airbnb, these are businesses that are about mutual benefit between different market segments, the drivers and the passengers, say, in an Uber context. Banks are similar businesses. It's borrowers and lenders and a few extra parties there. So when we start thinking in these ways, then mutual benefit becomes important. And that's where permaculture comes in. Because permaculture is about using the constraints of soil and wind and moisture and the organisms themselves, because the organisms affect each other. And it's about generating smallholding farms that provide a way of life for people who can no longer live in cities because there's no more fossil fuels. All right, ignore that part. The principles of permaculture are really useful. The trouble is, they are just about smallholding farms. So we need to think more deeply about things that are not smallholding farms. I mean, industrial agriculture does provide a really useful metaphor. The closer we look at industrial agriculture, the more we see things that look like some of the business problems we're used to looking at. So, for example, this thing looks like a punch card in the middle of this. All these fields are effectively monocultures. There's only a few organisms that they grow, lots and lots of copies of the same organism. And most of those organisms we can't eat, the leaves and the stems and the roots and all that stuff. But the cattle can eat them. So these are feedlots for cattle in the middle, and then we can have the meat and the milk from the cattle. Well, if we look a bit closer, there's an awful lot of food we're growing that's going to these cattle. And then, well, the cattle, they excrete stuff that cannot be used as fertilizer because it's so full of pesticides and herbicides and antibiotics and things that are not going to be very good. Besides which, of course, the fertilizer that's coming out of the cattle, there's a whole bunch of things that are not sustainable there. We can talk about that for a long time too. We're not going. What can eat that stuff that they're excreting? Algae. Most of what we're growing is feeding algae. And you might think, oh, well, let's see. Most of the work we're doing is going to the benefit of a tiny little ingrown class of people that are the major directors and major shareholders of the massive businesses that own the center of every city on the planet. Just possibly that's a bit of a catastrophe. If mutual benefit is our intent, we're not trying to build a class of Bourbon kings. That's sort of not the point. But if you think about it, really, you and I and everyone we know, we are all far richer today than the last Louis, whether it's 14, 15, or 16 that you count as the last Louis. Louis, if he wanted to listen to his favorite song, he needed to wait until the band turned up to his concert hall. And if he wanted to hear it again, he had to ask for an encore. And you can just Spotify all day. The same is true for medicine, for travel, well, maybe not travel today, but information flow, learning, all the things that make life worthwhile. You are fantastically richer than the richest king or emperor on this planet 150, 200 years ago. So mutual benefit, that's working for us. That's great. But this kind of catastrophe, and yes, we're living through one, well, we've got to work intentionally on that. Ecosystems thinking is not just an abstract idea. So I mentioned permaculture. I and the other independent senior agile coaches in XSCALE Alliance, we got excited about this permaculture idea. There are 12 principles of permaculture. We tried to generalize them to the organizations that we're working with in the first place. And we worked on this for 4 or 5 months. I should mention Andrew Sanyal, Philippe Briere, James Gorman, Shingi Kanu Kamway, Francis Liu. I'm leaving people. It doesn't matter. We worked on this for a while, and we went, "Oh, this sounds nice. These sound useful." But maybe we've done violence to permaculture. We started feeling guilty. We changed the words, and this is stuff that's in use all around the world. What do we do? Bill Mollison died in 2016. Couldn't write to him. Dave Holmgren's still around. So I wrote Dave, and Dave replied. And Dave liked it. And it gave us a bit of a blessing and some positive feedback, and we folded that in. So I'm going to show you stuff that has actually had a blessing by the founder of permaculture. But I don't want you to think about it that way. It's not about my authority, his authority, Francis Liu's authority, anybody's authority. It doesn't make sense. And if you can find ways to go, wait a second, that's stupid, then I want to know about it, please. XSCALE Alliance is itself a learning ecosystem. It's like the Linux of the Agile world. And we want to learn from each other. We want to learn from you. So whether you're watching this recorded or whether you're here live, please do put your black hat on and shoot holes in what I'm about to do. And I'm going to go fast. We have a bunch of stuff. I think we did an XSCALE podcast on this stuff a while ago that went for like 2 hours. So you can listen to that if you want a longer thing. And we kind of took these principles and rebranded them as the descaling principles. I kind of think we need to rebrand them back again because while descaling is important and near and dear to our hearts, this is more general than that. So anyway, here's the deal. We're suggesting that these principles are critically important for building healthy ecosystems. That industrial agriculture thing I showed you before, that's an ecosystem. There's mutual benefit going on there. Pollen from one field pollinates plants in the other field. Well, okay, with GMOs, they don't breed true. It might be monstrous pollen. You won't get any seeds you can use. But in principle, it's an ecosystem, just not necessarily healthy. We want healthy ecosystems. So you might think of principles that are better than these. We want to know about those too. Directly responsible individuals, the old Apple idea. Business, design, and tech stakeholders make decisions together as peers to build solutions that fit each other's constraints. Ooh, that sounds like something out of the Agile Manifesto. Business and development meet daily, it says in the Agile Manifesto. Of course, in the Agile world we live in, they don't. Something wrong with that. It would be really good if we had business and design and technology making decisions together as peers. That'd be wonderful. We need a little protocol for them to do that together. And we've got one. We call it Leadership as a Service. And if you go along to Agile Summit 2020, that's part of XPeace, and you'll hear me talk about it. Don't have very much time, so I'm going to go fast. Capture and store learning in small self-organizing teams. As these work on the current bottleneck, they become capable of opening future ones. Wait, what? We store learning in small self-organizing teams? I thought we stored it in wikis and databases and filing cabinets full of specs. I guess if we don't store it in the teams, then the next team to come along is going to have to pull those things out of the filing cabinet and read them. I've never actually seen a team do that. I've seen lots of teams put things in filing cabinets. I've never seen a team take all the specs that the last team was working on the project before this project out of the filing cabinet and read them all before starting work. I haven't seen that happen. Maybe you have. I'd really like to hear from you if you have, because that would be a very, very interesting experience. But storing learning in small self-organizing teams, that's something that makes sense to me, because the learning that's important to us is human conversations and human understanding of human businesses. So the current bottleneck, this is a throughput accounting or theory of constraints term, but basically it's the dominant constraint that limits the throughput of the system. As they work on the current one, they become capable of opening future ones. It would be a good idea if we knew what the current bottleneck was and we got them working on that. We'll come to that. Number 3, work on outcomes, not outputs. Teams continuously quantify their contributions to business throughput. What's that? Elliot Goldratt invented a quantification of business throughput. It's actually a kind of accounting you can do. It's not complicated, and it makes a massive difference to the decisions that your leaders and your managers make. The fact that they're ignorant of it, or if they aren't ignorant of it, they don't know how to use it, that's our problem to solve as coaches. Prioritize the current bottleneck and minimize the work in progress. Well, prioritizing the current bottleneck, if we don't know what it is, we don't understand throughput accounting, then all of our priorities are bullshit, if you pardon my French. It doesn't matter how red in the face your product owner goes and how much he insists that his gut is right. He's not doing the math. It's not. Align small groups of teams into self-managing business streams that continuously adapt their work priorities to changing market feedback. This all sounds like common sense, doesn't it? But as coaches, ask yourself, how often have you seen this happen? Self-managing business streams. How do you get self-management to happen? How do you get these people to work together to manage their own work? That's something that gets delegated to managers. Evan was telling us that if we have self-management, doesn't mean we get rid of the managers. I don't think it means we get rid of the managers. I think it means we turn the managers into servant leaders. How do we turn managers into servant leaders? It ain't going to happen by telling them, hey, now you are going to be a servant leader. That has never worked. We have a little protocol we call leadership as a service in XSCALE. And so if you want to understand more about it, you can go and Google it, or you can come along to Agile Summit 2020. I'm not doing an ad for them, just that's what I'm going to be talking about next month. Okay, so continuously adapt their work priorities to changing market feedback. You would need to measure things. All those pirate metrics, you would need to be able to figure out what the analytics are for them. If you're doing a change program, the same thing applies. Pirate metrics, we just talked about how they apply to change. You have to hook up analytics to them too. Reward mutual benefit across business streams to reduce silos, dependencies, duplication, and lost opportunities, and to share resources, services, and learning. How do we reward mutual benefit? We're used to, if my project's going great, your project's going bad, and you're working weekends and evenings, and I go home and I see my kids and I go, oh, mate, I'm so sorry for you. I can see you're really, really stressed. Bye! Because your KPIs aren't my KPIs. Your success is not my success. Your failure is not my failure. There is a school of thought called open book management that we baked into XSCALE. It's actually pioneered by two guys, Jack Stack and John Case. And if you want to read a bunch about it, you can Google open book management. You can go and look at the Great Game of Business. There's lots to say about that. I've only got 5 minutes left, so I might not go in great depth across all of these, but I'm going to touch on them, and I'm sorry for running out of time. Anyway, so the deal is this. We have to be rewarded based on the improvement to business throughput. Anything else is bullshit. Whether it's called an OKR or a KPI, it's not something we should be motivated to improve. So top-line business throughput, that needs to be our common OKR. And there's much more to say about that too. Mercilessly refactor business streams. Reuse, recycle, or reduce all resources a stream produces so all contribute to business throughput and none to waste. So not just waste in the lean sense. It's the stuff we're producing that we're not getting money for. So for example, in Sweden, some regulations came in that every factory had to take all its waste heat and use it to provide heating throughout the factory. They pretty soon realized they had so much waste heat that was coming out of the smokestacks of the factory, they could then supply it to the neighborhoods, to the houses in the neighborhoods around the factories, and eliminate most of the electricity generation that was needed for heating those houses. That kind of thing was also behind what Amazon did when they went, oh, we're going to take all these excess servers we've got, and we're going to open them up for use by everybody else. We'll call it Amazon Web Services. These days, that waste is worth more to Amazon than their entire retail business. These are important principles. It's not just bullshit. Design breadth first. Step back to see patterns in and between markets and business streams. These inform designs we can detail only as we learn more. Breadth first. Product management. There's nothing in Scrum about that. How do we do that? There's some really simple techniques we use to do that. I'm not going to go into detail on that because we don't have time. Don't delegate, collaborate. People and teams are in the right relationships when their conversations evolve to support each other's work and learning. That sounds obvious, but those conversations, as coaches, we don't focus on them. We focus on, oh, is this little team doing its thing? Not what are the conversations going on between the teams? How do we beef up those relationships? Take time to simplify and automate solutions. Simple automated systems cost less than big manual ones with less work to maintain business outcomes. This is the 0th way of DevOps. It's not encoded in Kim's 3 ways. I don't know why. Ought to be. But this is more fundamental than that. This is about the way our businesses work. The fact that everything's automated on the Starship Enterprise is not because that's a primitive way of being. So the reduced cost and the less work, these are huge deals. And we actually let product managers steamroll us on this kind of automation. Oh, we can't afford it, they say. The real dollars are wrapped up in throughput accounting. If we can get them to use that, they won't say that anymore. Cost accounting is what leads to that kind of thinking. User and value experimentation. I'm all out of time. By value, I mean monetary value, expected monetary value. The other two, enrich interfaces and serve underserved customers, and transform to embrace change. I leave you to look at those yourself, but I'll leave you with one last anecdote. Transform to embrace change. Well, there's two kinds of change. There's the change that gets forced on you, like COVID, and it's the change that you generate. It gets forced on others, like iPhone as an ecosystem. So this stuff, this is what we need to focus on as business agile coaches. And if you want the tactical stuff, well, come along to the talk next month about XBeast. And if you want more about that, there's also this URL where XSCALE Alliance gets its act together. And that's bang on the hour.
What wonderful talk, Peter. Such inspiring. Thank you very much. We really enjoyed all the insight you shared. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to listen to your insights, especially the perspective, the framing, the ecosystem, all those concepts. They really inspire us and they change our perspective to all the things that we see and the way we look at the things. Thank you very much, very much. We were with Peter, CEO of XSCALE, an ecosystem learning, really open. And we enjoyed having him today. We were honored to have him, and we will be always honored to have him on our initiatives and conferences.
Back at you, mate. No worries.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so just in time, we will be now taking some break, a break of 1 hour. So we come back to be connected to Saturn Room at 14:30. Like 1 hour from now. Super, bon ben oui, c'était pour remercier Peter Merel pour son pitch magnifique. Magnifique.
One thing,
Yes.
Marwan, I should say, if there's a break now, if anyone's got any questions, then I'm happy to stick around and shoot the shit. So
Yes. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions? Well, if you have any questions, you can just go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, we can go for a break, as you prefer.
I have a question.
Yes, Paula.
So before learning about throughput accounting, I've had conversations with members of a PMO about how the type of accounting that they were doing was driving project-based versus product-based development.
Mm-hmm.
What they told me was, well, if you can convince the CFO, then we'll be okay with trying a different method. So when we go into companies, how do we engage the CFO in these types of conversations, or is that not even important?
Oh, I think it's critically important. Most CFOs, if they're dealing with agile coaches at all, regard the agile coaches as a cost center. They don't understand that there's actually a business benefit in this. The claims that have been made are all about productivity in an internal sense. They're not about sales. They're not about the relationship between top and bottom lines. And in a current context, most CFOs are completely lost. They have no idea, none of the tools at their disposal are going to help them make decisions. So when it comes to bringing these sorts of ideas, we're able to say two things to the CFO. And the first is, when it comes to this agile thing that you regard as a cost center, well, what if we made it cheaper for you? What if we made it less risky? Would that be interesting? But let's talk about the other end. Let's talk about the top line, because CFOs care about the top line even more than the bottom line. What if we could bring business agility, we could adapt to market conditions faster and better than we're doing at the moment? What would the CFOs say to the ability to make more money? CFOs have to care about both ends of the equation. If they don't, then the share value is going to suffer and a CFO can't afford that to happen. So there is a pitch that as Agilists, we never make to a CFO. We talk about, oh, we're going to reduce waste, we're going to improve the bottom line. We never talk about, oh, we're going to give you the ability to adapt to changing market conditions, which right now are changing faster than ever before in history. And we're going to enable you to seize the market opportunities. And we're going to enable you to pivot your organization so that the money that you are hemorrhaging is actually going to go to the market opportunities that are generated by the upheaval. That's the language that they're willing to listen to. That's what they want. That's what their salesmen say to them. That's what their marketeers say to them. If we can talk that language, the language of business agility, they will hear us because it's their job.
Thank you.
Great, great. Any other questions so far?
Sorry, I got cut off earlier, but I had a question about the ecosystems attitude you were talking about, and I was just thinking, there's an assumption that whoever's developing that ecosystem has the best intentions in mind. And do you think you're maybe giving too much power to an organization? Because if you think about the approach Apple takes, right, it's all about the profitability of Apple, and everything is for the profitability of that organization. And actually it gives itself incredible power, and it's worth more than large countries in its kind of revenues. It's quite scary, really, in a way, giving that much power to an organization. Do you think you're kind of empowering people to control ecosystems?
Evil.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, it could be used for good or bad, right?
Well, I guess the way I look at it is Conway's law. I think that the behavior of the corporations tends to resemble the internal processes of the organizations, and a lot of them get affected by, Pornell's iron law of bureaucracy.
I've never heard of it before.
Jerry Pournelle, a science fiction writer, he said that in all organizations have two kinds of people. They have people who care about the goals and the benefits to be achieved by the function of the organization, and then there are people who don't care about that. And his iron law is that all organizations evolve until they are controlled by the second kind of people. Sad. So I kind of think that ecosystems thinking is not going to be very much used to those kinds of people. It's not about climbing the greasy pole. It gives tools to the first kind of people. Now, do I know that? Of course I don't know that. But I can imagine trying to preach ecosystems thinking to, a certain president of the United States and not getting very far. And the prior president of the United States might have had an interesting chat. So I like to think that if we give them tools that enable them to prosper through mutual benefit, well, then we are the other end of mutual benefit. So I'm all for that.
Okay.
First of all, I have to say that I'm pretty delighted to attend this talk. So I have quick questions. It's how we can have a right balance between stuff we are accountable for, like, the weekly report, the monthly result, and quarterly delivery, and having time to assess our way of designing product, because all speakers speak about like Zappos, like Facebook, Google, Xiaomi, but
and we're not them.
All company, exactly,
Yeah, we're not them. We don't have their leaders. We can't do this. That's the question?
Yes. This is the question. Yes.
So here's how we deal with it with XSCALE. We go to the leader and we say, okay, so you have a problem with your agile capability. That's why you're talking to us. Or you want an agile capability. That's why you're talking to us. There's got to be some problem that you want us to solve that has to do with agile. Otherwise, you're probably not talking to us. So we could solve that problem piecemeal, and we could charge you a lot of money for many years, and you could wind up without much of a solution. What if we were to do something that's going to generate benefits really quickly? and isn't going to cost very much because there'll be self-propagating benefits. You're going to have to change some things to enable this to happen, but quicker and better and cheaper, and above all, less risky, which is to say safer. If we can give you quicker, better, cheaper, safer, will you let us show you some outcomes in, say, a 3-month period? It'll be experimental. But if we can demonstrate this to you in 3 months, do you think that's worth a shot? Most of the time, those guys are very risk-oriented. So the moment you say safer, they're interested. And if you say, well, look, what we're going to do either will or won't generate a really useful business outcome in 3 months. If it does, then let's grow it. We're never going to push change into the organization. We'll never disrupt the way that everything else is working. Those reports, those baselines, those budgets, all that stuff will keep flowing exactly the way it does right now. All cost accounting based. But this new capability, we're going to build a business agile capability. And it's going to work differently. You're going to use throughput accounting to make our decisions over here because we want that thing to grow. And if it doesn't, well, then you should fire us. And you can fold all those people back in, but you're not risking very much because there's only going to be a few people involved. If we get a dozen, 20 people, that's plenty to start with. We're not going to be able to get more change champions in a multi-100-person organization than that anyway. So once we've been able to demonstrate it, then we can split and double. And I'll give you a concrete example of where I did that. 2010 in Australia, in Sydney, IAG, Insurance Australia Group. I was brought in by 2 senior managers, Dave Carpenter, Bernard Cito, without the blessing of Alan Matthews, the CIO at the time. They had been burned. The business had been burned by Bespoke Agile. And they wanted me to find fertile ground to do a bit of Agile by stealth. Let's prove it. And then Val will bless it, and then we can grow it. I spent 2 weeks talking to managers that said much the same stuff you said. Well, we need to get these reports and so on. I talked to some progressives. The progressives went, yeah, I want that. That's great, mate. Really love those ideas. But can't do it because those other guys, they won't do it. And there was a lot of this blame storming thing going on. I went back to Dave and Bernard after 2 weeks. I said, can't do it. Not possible. This is a very conservative, very hidebound business. It was very threatened, though, by the little players in digital channels back in 2010. I said, but there is one thing we could do. He said, what's that? I said, we could cherry pick the progressives that I've found over the last 2 weeks, and we could make something that we'll call a small changes team. Because no one will be threatened by a small changes team. And it'll deploy through the hotfix pathway. Because we're going to automate tests, so there'll be better quality going through the hotfix pathway. We already have the manager there saying, if we can give better quality, she'll be on board. It took us 11 months to go from one of these end-to-end threads of capability to 16 of them by splitting and doubling. And 16 was most of the people who were in the group of 330 that Dave and Bernard had me come in to transform. They went on along to Agile Australia 2012 to trumpet their triumphant transformation. I got poached by Commonwealth Bank on the strength of that. So I can put hand on heart and say, there is a way to get that win to happen, but you've got to do pull transformation to do it.
That's great. So the word we keep is a pull transformation. I love that word. Great.
But did I answer? I don't know whether Brahim was satisfied with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Okay. Cool.
Great. Thanks a lot, Peter. It has been an honor to us to receive you today. Thank you very much.
You are always too kind, Marwan. All good. Take care.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. And catch up here in like 45 minutes. We will be restarting the session again. Thank you very much for your presence.
Merci.
Merci à vous. On se revoit dans 45 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci à vous.